Hello and welcome to the Americano Show, a series of discussions about American life, politics and prejudices. I am delighted to be joined today by Eric Kaufmann, who is in the Spectator's office. That noise you might be able to hear is the heavy rain outside, so apologies for that. Eric is, let's get his title right, Professor of Politics and Director of the Centre for Heterodox Social Science at the University of Buckingham, and he's the author of several books, including this, the most recent one, which is out now, which is called Taboo: How Making Race Sacred Produced a Cultural Revolution. Eric, congratulations. It's a fascinating book. Did it take you longer to do than your other books? Because it's a pretty comprehensive work.
No, I would say it took a little, not quite as long, but, I did my last book, God, I guess that's 2018 now, so that's 6 years ago. Yeah. And the previous one was 2010, 8 years before then. So what tends to happen is I'll tend to do research and let these ideas marinate for a while, and then I'll pull it all together. So by the time I actually write the book, it doesn't take that long, because it's more a matter of pulling things together and just, writing every day. Yeah. But I couldn't sit down and write that book tomorrow.
Because it's a pretty comprehensive work and a pretty thorough synthesis of what created the cultural revolution that we seem to be living through.
Yeah, and I think probably I've benefited because there have been quite a few books, let's face it, on this topic in the last few years. I kind of have now been able to say, okay, there's now a literature. It's like a scholarly field that's developed. So I'm trying also to make sense of the different approaches that have come out, Chris Rufo and Yascha Mounk and Greg Lukianoff and Francis Fukuyama and all these people trying to grapple with this thing that has just exploded in the press and is redefining our culture. So I've kind of tried to get hold of that and say, well, where did it come from? And really we have competing arguments. You have, crudely put, the cultural Marxist argument, class didn't work out, they didn't rise up in revolt, so the Marxists turned to identity. Herbert Marcuse, and so Chris Rufo's book is very much about that, America's cultural revolution. And I think there's definitely some mileage in that, but that argument would suggest that this is a plan to a war of position, take over institutions, reproduce your epigones, and take it over. Then you have this other strand, which is not as well developed. Chris Caldwell, Richard Hanania have written books on the development of civil rights law in the U.S. and how that leads to affirmative action and then disparate impact, and then eventually it leads to kind of harassment laws, which are the precursor to speech codes. Yes. And in a way, that anti-white racism story kind of goes back to the affirmative action, which begins in the late 60s, and eventually it goes from saying you can't discriminate on the basis of race to, as Hanania says, if you don't discriminate on the basis of race, you're breaking the law, even though the law says you can't discriminate on the basis. But that none of that had anything to do with Herbert Marcuse and the Black Panthers or any of the cultural Marxist stuff that, Rufo so capably writes about, and others so capably. It doesn't have anything to do with postmodernism or any of these things which are important, but I don't think are central to the story.
You have attempted to kind of synthesize all the things that made wokeness and this woke moment we're living through. But I wanted to ask you about what's been going on this year to begin with. Because at the beginning of the year, we had Maxine Gay, the Harvard's president, who was forced to resign after a scandal about her came out. And there seems to be a broader push back against the DEI, the diversity, equity and inclusion agenda, that dominates so many people's lives now. You're not convinced, are you, that the pushback is that strong and that we are still living, what you're saying in the book is we are still living through the Great Awakening?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to sort of downplay the extent of the shifts that have occurred, let's say in the last few years, whether it be the fight against critical race theory and gender ideology in schools or ESG or DEI. All of these things are really important. The New York Times, editorializing for free speech. The Washington Post editorializing against things like mandatory diversity statements. This is important, but this is senior liberals walking it back a little bit. This is not actually going to matter, I think, 20 years down the road. And what I like to do is compare it with McCarthyism, where you had that moment in 1953, the sort of "have you no decency, sir," and that was the end of McCarthy and McCarthyism. But I think the difference then was the young population was not really pro-McCarthy. Whereas if you look at the structure of public opinion now, and there's a lot of numbers in the book on survey data that I've used on attitudes to the culture wars, you see young people are much more in favor of cancel culture and much less tolerant of offensive speech than older people. And so the generational dynamics are going to propel this into territory which is more anti-free speech, I believe. If you look at the French election, for example, or if you look at even the UK election, what you see is that on the right of the spectrum, yes, young people are more populist, so they're more Reform than Tory, they're more kind of RN than they are Republican. But as a share of the total vote, it's still a left-leaning demographic. And, you saw that obviously most clearly in Britain.
And becoming more left-leaning and more radical?
It's become more left-leaning. I would say that young men have, if anything, they are similar to their predecessors or, maybe ever so slightly more right-wing. I'm not sure there's much difference. It's more that young women are a lot more left-wing than older women, and even their age in the past. So an 18-year-old in 1970 or 2000, 18-year-old woman was just a lot less left-wing than an 18-year-old woman in 2016 or 2020.
You mentioned the psychology there. You talk a bit about Freudianism and the importance of that informing this movement, and of course postmodernism. How do those two things, those two factors, influence the woke world we live in?
Well, I think they matter, but I don't think they matter as much as the Rufos and Fukuyamas and all these people. I mean, say they do. These high intellectual systems and ideas, I don't think are the driver. They're kind of, Jonathan Haidt talks about the elephant and the rider. The elephant is the unconscious emotions that are driving you. The rider is telling the intellectual story. I think postmodernism and Freudianism and these other things are a bit more the rider. What I think is really driving this is just that raw emotional attachment to the plight of African Americans, indigenous, gay, women, whatever the particular sacred group is, encoded in stories, myths, movies, and narratives, so slavery, Jim Crow, even the Holocaust perhaps, but that's maybe not as important now. But these narratives are kind of sacred narratives, and that's what drives the emotions behind this. So I don't think you need the whole cultural Marxist conquest plan. I think a lot of this is just, I feel guilty, I feel empathy, and I fear the majority. And those three legs of the stool, those kind of moral intuitions, that's enough to get a lot of people on board. So I'm kind of blaming the bleeding heart liberals. And I mean, yes, the cultural Marxists are important, but they're like the band. The bleeding heart liberals are the sound system and the amplification. So without the bleeding heart liberals, this small number of cultural Marxists wouldn't get anywhere.
And the original sin then is racism and race, which is why race is the taboo that has been made sacred.
Yeah, so I argue that the mid-1960s anti-racism taboo that suddenly emerges in public life and was commented upon by many people at the time is like the big bang of our moral universe. And we've been living through the sort of outworking of that for the last 60 years. And partly what we're living through is continuous with things that happened earlier. And so this idea that what we've experienced, this great awakening, as Matthew Iglesias calls it, is not that new. I would say it is an expansion of scope, but it isn't fundamentally very different in terms of its ideas. And you could find speech codes, obviously the big speech codes movements and political correctness was in that second awakening. That was when I went to university in the 80s and 90s. And then you had the first awakening in the late 60s, which is when you had black studies and Panther ideology and a lot of these things emerging, affirmative action.
Is that why do you think so many people feel disorientated by this whole world? Because for many people it feels like a 1980s argument that is still somehow ongoing, and people aren't quite sure where we are in this seeming revolution of our morality.
Well, yeah, I think people, although I seem to see a lot of people claiming this has sort of come out of nowhere and, everything was just perfect in like the 2000s or the 90s, when it most clearly wasn't perfect. I mean, in terms of if you look at the debates over multiculturalism and the curriculum in the 90s, for example, and hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has to go, everything was Eurocentric, minority self-esteem, and you look at, for example, we're talking about DEI and diversity training. Well, there was racial sensitivity training. There was all of this stuff happening in corporations. We had affirmative action. We had, overheated definitions of rape happening in the early 90s. So I don't think this is new. It's just that it's spread perhaps more off campus than it had.
And it's cyclical like a fashion, in that, you talk about radical chic, Tom Wolfe's term, in the book. It's also retro chic, isn't it? You can see in a lot of the protesters today that they're aping the habits, the styles, the music, the fashion, the clothes, and so on of 60s and 70s radicals. They like to see themselves as playing this part.
Yeah, that's true. I guess, it's particularly Columbia, and you can see that, they want to have their moment. I think that's true, but also I think a lot of them are fairly ignorant of history generally. There's a lot of amnesia, and they think there's something new. So I don't think it's that. I think that you've kind of had this outworking of this logic of care, harm, and equality for identity groups, and it's metastasized to the point where you now have 70 or 80% of American college students in surveys saying that someone who says trans is a mental disorder should not be allowed to speak on campus. Yeah. You have almost nobody saying that such a person should be allowed on campus, or 70% saying if the professor offends the students, they should be reported to the administration. I mean, that's the kind of level that we're seeing. And now, of course, we've also got other things happening with the young Zoomers. We have an explosion of mental health issues. We have an explosion of LGBT identification reaching, 20-25%. So there are a whole bunch of things happening to that young population who are going to be the median voter and the median leader of 20 years from now.
And you have, it's an overused word, but you have a massive spread of narcissism as something that is prevalent in society. And a stat that I'd never read before that I've written your book about, I think it's in Robert Putnam, it's by Robert Putnam, found it, that a survey asking, I am an important person, in 1950, 12% of people agreed with that. In 1980, 80% of people agreed with that. And I was wondering now, it'd probably be 100%, but you might get a lower figure.
Well, yeah, I think you had these different layers. So you first had the kind of expressive individualism coming in the sort of 70s, 80s, rise in divorce, all of that was occurring. More children out of wedlock. So that's kind of phase one. But then we also, on the back of it, have this kind of humanitarian, egalitarian, what I would call woke cultural socialism coming in more strongly after that. And I think they're separate components. I actually think that individualist expressive component is part of it. So you should favor diversity over commonality and change over tradition. So that is definitely an aspect of the diversity picture. But now the drivers are more around that we can't offend anybody, and if you do, then you must be canceled. That's kind of coming out of this humanitarian psychotherapy, which starts in the 60s. And then the equity stuff about, equal outcomes is from the 60s with affirmative action, quotas.
And so you have now, in this backlash that we talked about at the beginning, a lot of it is coming from liberals who are disoriented by what's going on. They are completely unable to recognise what they thought were their fellow travellers in liberalism. And also, you put it very well in your introduction about how they sound. I'm going to misquote you, but how they sound. They sound like Islamist sort of scholars talking to fundamentalists.
Yeah,
they can't commit the heresy of saying something that would be un-Islamic, and they can be caught out if they do say something anti-Islamic. So that's what you often get. You've got it in the Harper's letter, which was this famous sort of statement of people worried about woke ideology. A lot of throat clearing. Before you can say anything, you have to say, "I'm a good liberal." I like gay people, and I'm not a racist. And you have to say that. It's like a litany before you can start talking.
Yeah, I mean that's right. I mean, and this is so I focus a lot on liberal. When I say liberal, I basically mean modern liberal, left liberal, not classical liberal, which I don't think is well represented amongst people who identify as liberal. So you have this left liberalism, and I think that's kind of the backstory here too, because we've had the rise of left liberalism really since the early 20th century, the liberal progressives, John Dewey and Jane Addams and those sorts of people. That is the beginning. It's sort of cosmopolitanism, but I think there's kind of a slippage and a sort of gateway drug here from cosmopolitanism, which is critical of the majority, to early multiculturalism, people like Randolph Bourne in the 1910s and 20s, which is kind of very critical of the Anglo-Protestant majority, in the context of prohibition and immigration restriction acts and so on, very critical of them and their culture. Moving towards critical race, the critical theory. And I think it is all part of a piece. Now, I think that the left liberals did a lot of good. So I don't get me wrong. I think they did do a lot of good. And a lot of what we're living through is the overreach of these principles of sensitivity and of equality. But yeah, and so what we arrive at now is you've got the liberals who, their attitude would be, oh, we're too white, we're too male, we need more diversity. That's kind of the liberal approach. The Ibram X. Kendi cultural Marxist critical race theory approach is we need an amendment to the Constitution that mandates perfect equity in every sector. Now, you could say those are radically different, but actually, the thing about left liberalism, the first attitude, which says we need more diversity and we're not equal enough, is it's open-ended. And so it can't resist somebody who comes along and says, we want a quota and we want it in the Constitution. There's no fundamental difference. And so this is where I say, unbounded evolutionary left liberalism results in extremism, just the same way cultural Marxist revolutionary Black Panther, Antifa-style extremism results in the same thing. And so now what we've got is a fusion. We have some concepts from the cultural Marxists, like critical race theory and gender ideology, and some concepts from the left liberals, like, for example, mandatory diversity training, like affirmative action and DEI. So we've got both of them converging. And what my book tries to argue is we have undersold the power of that left liberal evolutionary extremism because we focus just on the cultural Marxists and the postmodernists. Actually, it's this, people didn't really know what the plan was. They were just guilty, empathetic, and feared the majority. And they just followed where the avant-garde led, and that took them to where we are today. And so I think we've actually got to question not just the cultural Marxist and critical theorists, not just the Ibram X. Kendis, but we actually have to unpick some of that multicultural liberalism of the 90s, which got us here.
Yes, and that will be very tricky.
I think it's tricky because I think a lot of people. So there's a good survey question YouGov asks, which is, do you support political correctness because it protects minority groups, or do you oppose political correctness because it stifles free speech? And if you take, for example, academia, you're looking at about 75% pro-PC and maybe 20-25% against. Now, if you were to ask academics, do you support firing people who do controversial research that offends minorities, you'll only get 10%, right? So they're not necessarily progressive illiberals to the extent of wanting to shut down and fire and punish. But on the other hand, they're kind of supporting this ethos of, well, can't we all be nice and kind, and you shouldn't say things that might offend, and actually that is the logic that got us where we are. And so I think they are not, they are the guilty party as much as the Ibram X. Kendis in this. And so I would like to see the left liberals do a bit more soul searching and not just say, well, we can do our left liberalism and it's the same principles. Care, harm, and equality for minority groups are the most important. Anti-racism, anti-fascism, that's the most important stuff. But no, we shouldn't cancel people because we believe in free speech, right? And so they're trying to put Band-Aids on what I think is a fundamentally flawed set of values. And I think what we need is, yes, we need to care about equality and we need to care about the care-harm values, but they have to be balanced by other moral foundations.
You use a lot of data in
Yes.
your work as a social scientist. It's very natural that you do. But isn't the problem with taboos that they are, by their nature, antithetical to data? Because people in surveys restrain what they really think because of the taboos they feel. So, as you say, depending on the phrasing of the question, but even if the question is well phrased, there's still a lot of people won't say what they think.
Yeah, I guess there's a whole debate over whether people will, on an anonymous survey, tell you what they really think. And I think they're more likely to do that on an anonymous survey than they are in a committee meeting.
Yeah.
Right. So,
but even so, they might not.
You're right, and in fact, there are different survey techniques that are designed to elicit people's true beliefs, and they often will show a gap. So, for example, if you ask American academics if they, would you be willing to discriminate against a known Trump supporter? 25 to 30% say they wouldn't hire a known Trump supporter. But if you do a hidden, there's a technique which I'm not going to go into, you'll get about just over 40%. So there is a gap. This is an interesting question. I guess I've kind of tended to believe the survey data. So, for example, roughly by a ratio of 2 to 1, social science academics in Anglosphere countries support what are called mandatory diversity statements, which are essentially political litmus tests. Do you support DEI ideology or not? And if you don't support it, you're not eligible for this research grant or this job. Now, Harvard has recently, and MIT have recently banned those, but they are supported by a majority of academics. Now, is that because, I still think that they believe in those things, because I think they are committed as their most important value to the so-called social justice values of equal outcomes and emotional harm protection as just the most important things. Now, if you phrase the question and you say, well, are you willing to give up your academic freedom to set your own reading list to ensure proportionality by race and gender, then the majority will say no. Yeah. If it affects their job security and their academic freedom, they'll back away. But if it's just about abstract principles, they will prioritize these call them the DEI or cultural socialist principles. I think they have a higher affection for those principles. I think the classical liberal principles are there, but they don't have the stories behind them. So a lot of the book is really about the mythos, the myths and the symbols and the emotional charges. The emotional charge behind the anti-racism, anti-sexism, anti-trans homophobia stuff is just so much stronger than the emotional charge behind the free speech defense.
Well, and you occasionally get a kind of depth charge, an emotional depth charge come along. The two recent ones would be the Me Too moment, when suddenly everybody sort of thought all sexual morality was going to be redefined entirely along believable women.
Right.
That seemed to be the way it was going. And then, of course, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, which was another moment where suddenly everybody thought they were suddenly in a kind of, and I don't think the internet is particularly helpful here, suddenly everybody thinks and is quite worried or excited that they are in a very, very fast-moving revolutionary moment.
Well, yeah, you're right. So you have these galvanizing events, and you see this. In a way, my American title is The Third Awakening, and it's about these awakenings, right, which are almost spiritual, religious, emotional enthusiasms, and people are riffing off each other, and you have that virality, and that's, I think, what we saw with George Floyd and Me Too. I would add a third one, which is a bit more parochial because I'm Canadian, which is the mass graves hoax in British Columbia, where they claimed that there were 215 bodies buried in a former Catholic school. I think it was Catholic school. And the entire media and political establishment lined up behind this, and they haven't walked it back. And it's a complete hoax. It's like Pizzagate level. And there's no documentary evidence. There aren't parents looking for missing kids. There's no forensic evidence. Yes. And now we've had 100 churches burned. We've had flags lowered to half-mast. We've had National Orange Shirt Day. All of this religious stuff built up on top of this moment. Yeah. I think that's crazier even than George Floyd and crazier than Me Too.
Well, hoaxing is an interesting element. I mean, we've seen the rise of the hate hoax in recent years. Jussie Smollett was his name, who sort of pretended he'd been beaten up, or paid actors indeed to beat him up and pretend they were Trump fans. And the other things on campuses, people sort of spray painting walls with racist stuff, so they could then claim they were feeling threatened and so on.
Well,
This is a thing that's going on.
Well, Wilfred Riley I think he's at Kentucky, or I can't remember which university he's at, but he's an excellent writer, an African-American sociologist, is he, a political scientist, but he's done an entire book on race hoaxes. Whereas if you went back to kind of the second awakening in the late 80s, early 90s, you actually had real, like, proper racist things happening on campus. Yes. Real things. Now I think you would struggle to find it. You would struggle to find it. It's almost all hoaxes. I mean, of the ones that make the press. So, I think this shows you. And you also have the phenomenon of people pretending to be people of color. So whether that be indigenous, a lot of people are pretending, whites who pretend to be indigenous. Yes. Some like Rachel Dolezal, who will try and be African American, or Latino. So that shows you the power in the culture of the sacred groups, and if you are in the category of the fallen, you want to sort of get up that oppression point hierarchy.
And do you think that explains, as is sometimes said, that, well, of course, there are a lot of people who are transsexual to an extent. They are confused about their gender to an extent. Having a trans identity is so attractive for a lot of people who don't have another special characteristic that it draws them to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that because victimhood is the currency, for esteem and a certain kind of moral status. It could be that you're neurodivergent, but maybe that doesn't really tick the box as much as being trans. I mean, trans is still a very small, it should be said, it's still a very small share of the total. It's under 1% even amongst the 20 to 24s, and because we have a couple of censuses that ask this question, but there's been a huge explosion, no doubt, 1,000% increase or something, so I think that's part of it, is that you get a lot of attention because in our culture, which prizes victimhood, coming out as trans, suddenly you get a lot of attention, and maybe there have a lot of the people who do become trans, particularly the young girls who become men or boys, they have certain other mental illness issues and other autism and other things which tend to predict that. And then there is also, of course, the contagion effect, where it's happening in clusters amongst groups of friends, which shows that this isn't just something you're born with, but it's actually something that you're getting from your milieu. Yes. And of course, that's something that the woke side obviously doesn't want to talk about, the idea that this could be some kind of an emotional contagion.
Yeah. We talked a lot, or we talked on this podcast and another place, about post-liberalism, and that, a lot of people feel that to a certain extent this is a civil war within a dying liberal world. And that, the rage against wokery is just sort of striding through the wreckage of liberalism. But your book, as you've already suggested, is trying to say that liberalism can save itself from itself.
Yeah, I think that liberal principles, by which I mean the kind of, to use Isaiah Berlin's distinction, negative liberty, not the positive liberty, which I think is behind a lot of the problems, but the idea of negative liberty, procedural liberty, that, I can swing my fist up until the point it hits your nose. That kind of liberty, I think, is essential to the good society and is defensible. But I don't think that I don't think that inevitably must lead to the positive liberty, which says, no, you must slough off tradition, you must embrace diversity, you must, embrace all these other things. I don't think that's inevitable. I think you can have a kind of balanced set of ideals about the good life coexisting within this liberal structure of individual rights and duties. So, and I guess I would defend against the post-liberal claim. So Yoram Hazony, for example, would say that we should have, the woke have dominated the schools, which is absolutely true, and they are indoctrinating into their religion, which is absolutely true, and there's plenty of survey data in the book to show absolutely saturation level of this stuff. But the claim that, we have to replace it with something that is our own ideals, so we have to have public religion and religion in the school, that's something I don't think you need to have. I think you can have political neutrality in the civil service, in the schools, amongst university administrators, and that can be enforced. And you can have a neutral space where you treat competing arguments in a balanced way. I think that's possible. And I think it should be possible to get there. I don't think we have to replace their religion with our religion, with a kind of public religion. So that's maybe where I'm departing from the post-liberal.
But you think the answers, the solutions, the better outcomes will be bottom up, but also top down. I remember one bit you say that government, in your sort of proposed solutions, government is a useful thing because it hasn't been institutionalized in the way, say, universities have been.
Yeah, so here's where even though I'm not with the post-liberals in terms of public religion, I am with the national conservatives who say we need to use government. Market solutions are not going to get us there, and I think that's absolutely right. So, there are the more libertarian types, Greg Lukianoff, Yasha Monk, who say, well, we got to persuade, and I think we have to persuade, so we have to win the battle of ideas. But in the meantime, I don't think it is good enough to say that governments of the right have to sit back and watch as all these institutions are essentially captured and used to indoctrinate. My belief is actually the elected government is the one institution that the 2/3 majority in all the Anglo countries I've polled, 2/3 are anti-woke. Those preferences are not being expressed in those institutions. They need to use elected government to reform the institutions, to say to the universities, you're not censoring, you must uphold political neutrality, the civil service the same, the schools the same, and that's doable through patient legislation and stamina. And I think you can see in the red states in the U.S., particularly somebody like a Ron DeSantis.
Well, I was just thinking about his clash with Disney, which was quite an interesting clash because it split with it split opinion among conservatives. Because some people thought this was because Ron DeSantis said to Disney, if you carry on, what were they? They were opposing his law on. What was it?
Yeah, was it don't say gay or
don't say gay?
I think
in schools, yes. And so Disney opposed him on that, and then he said, well, if you do that, I will take away your special tax exempt status, or wherever it is in the Disney park. And a lot of conservatives felt this was a dangerous authoritarian turn. But you would be more with the people saying, actually, yes, government does need to get aggressive with companies that do.
Yeah, that's right, because I kind of see society as we have the state, we have institutions and citizens. It's not just government oppressing citizens. We have to guard against government. I think that is the Madisonian view, and I don't think that's actually as applicable. It still matters, but it's not as applicable now, where we have powerful institutions that are engaging in private, what Jonathan Turley at George Washington University calls private censorship and private illiberalism, where companies are essentially clamping down on employee speech. They are indoctrinating and engaging in violations of employees' freedom of conscience and so forth. I think you actually need government, which is elected and scrutinized by the press, to go in and reform these institutions. And I don't buy this idea that institutional autonomy matters as much as the autonomy of individuals. I don't think universities' autonomy to censor their staff and students should be given any kind of standing. I think the government, if the government is paying, now it's one thing if they're private and they have their own funding, that's separate, but to the extent we're talking about a public university that's getting funded through the government, which they are, I think they need to abide by what the government wants. And so I don't think universities' institutional autonomy is as important. I don't think the institutional autonomy of the civil service is especially important. Now, courts is different because that's a key check in a liberal democracy. But with the bureaucracy, for example, if they want to do DEI indoctrination, no, I don't think they should be allowed to do that. I think the government should be going in. Now, if they have to centralize the power, particularly over these matters to do with what is the culture and the politics of these institutions, then they're going to have to. Then they should centralize it. It's too bad but the problem we have is that the woke cultural left has infiltrated these institutions to essentially capture them and weaponize the kind of bleeding heart liberalism that I talked about before. And I don't think that's acceptable in a democracy. I think the institutions need to reflect the demos. And so the government is perfectly within its rights, whether that be mandating the curriculum in schools, banning critical race theory in schools, not universities. I think that's something they should do, and I would support that.